Here's a question. What is death? How do you know when it's happened? If you dive into the history of when somebody has been declared, yes, this has passed away, the definition has changed. I thought this was quite interesting. The ancient Egyptians, they believed that the soul resided in the heart. And so they would go to great extents to preserve the heart in the mummification process. They would make sure that the heart was preserved because that's going to be weighed in the afterlife, and if it's lighter than a feather, and their mythology said, then you get to pass on. And the way that it's lighter than a feather is if you lived a good life and all this stuff. And so they really preserved the heart because it was really important in their understanding of what happens. Interesting thing is they would discard the brain in the mummification process. They're like, what's that useless thing up there for? Like, it's just a big sponge, let's get rid of that. So that was not, they would keep all the other organs intact, and they had a very sacred place. But the brain, let's get rid of that thing. It's just a big wet sponge in the skull. Who needs that? So they got rid of that. The ancient Greeks kind of believed the same thing, except Aristotle was a Greek philosopher. He believed that the brain had a function. And he believed that the brain's function was to cool off the blood. Believe it or not, this is what he thought. It was like the radiator of your body. And that's to cool off I don't know why he thought that, but he did. But the Greek believers also thought that the soul resided inside of the heart. And so they went to great extents to protect the heart. And they had lots of poetry and symbolism around the heart. We still have that poetry and symbolism. We'll tell someone we love you, with our whole heart, right? The interesting thing is that the Jewish people, they believed that the seat of your will, the things that you desire, that was your heart. And then your lungs contained your life. So your life was in your lungs because the word for spirit is the same word for breath. And when you breathe, you're practicing and animating your body with your spirit by breathing in life, and the life resided there. But your emotions, you ever get butterflies in your stomach? They believe that, the emotions were in your bowels. So they would say, I love you with my whole bowels. A little bit weird, but that's, if we were to go, apples for apples on this one. But where is the soul? Have you ever thought about that? Where does the soul fit into this body that we are? And how do you know the soul has departed and the person has passed away? That was a question that we've been asking since the ancient Egyptians said it's in the heart, we're going to preserve the heart. Then this guy named William Harvey, right around 1628, he figured out that the heart has a function of circulating the blood. He somehow figured out that it was the pump that moved blood through your body. So he says, there's a biological function for that thing that we thought the soul resided inside of. So he figured that part out. And then come the philosophers. And if you ever want to get messed up in what you think and know about stuff, just read philosophy. That'll really mess you up. I'm teaching philosophy to high school kids on Fridays. It's a lot of fun. But there's this guy named Descartes. He's pretty much the father of modern day skepticism. Because he thought, how can you know anything is actually legit and real and true in this world? You can't. So he tried to figure out, what can you not deny at all? So he was saying, well, your senses can trick you. If you have a cold, the way that you taste food is funny. So you can't really rely on senses. Sometimes your senses deceive you. In the dark, you think there's a shadow over here, and it's a thief that's about to jump on you, and ends up it's just a bathrobe or something. Your senses can deceive you. So he's like, you can't rely on your senses to figure out what's actually real in life. So what he did was he went into the brain, and he said, well, I'm having doubts about life, and I can't doubt that I'm doubting, and he came up with this phrase that says, well, I think, therefore I am, I must be. I'm a thinking person. And so the fact that I'm thinking means that I exist. I can't deny that. I can, have all these doubts about other things, but the fact that I'm doubting shows that I'm a doubting individual. So I think, therefore I am, is what he then came up with. And he thought that that the soul resided in the brain because of his emphasis on thoughts. And he said there's this little gland called the pineal gland inside of the brain. And he said that's where the soul must be, in the pineal gland. Because in your brain, things are in pairs. You've got hemispheres. And the pineal gland is kind of the bridge between the two, is what he said. And he says, so therefore, it's the bridge between the material world and the immaterial world of the mind and thought. Because when you think stuff, you're not making things, right? You're just thinking them, and they're imaginary. They're in your brain. It's immaterial. But then we have the material world. So he believed the soul resided in the pineal gland of the brain and was the bridge between the physical and non-physical world. That's what Descartes thought way back in the day. And then comes the 1900s. And right around 1950s and 1960s, we start getting these things called life support. And we can keep an individual physically alive through a beating heart and respirators and all this kinds of stuff. And then they said, well, maybe it's not, because it was when the heart stopped. That's when we pronounced someone as being passed away, was when the heart stopped. But now we can keep someone's heart going indefinitely forever and ever and ever, amen. So then we had to switch, and we kind of went the Descartes route, and we said that now, when brain function stops, that's when we declare someone has been gone. But it's still, we don't really know where the soul resides in the body at all. And when is the soul officially gone, left the building, kind of a thing? We're not really sure. So this question that sounds like, oh, my screen stopped going here. Let me bring it back on. This whole question, what is death, seems to be a little bit stickier wicket than we thought, right? Seems to be like, well, when does it happen exactly? And we're not really 100% sure. All right, it's back on. What is death? We don't know when the soul leaves the body. They've even tried to weigh someone on the most sensitive scales when they die to see how much the soul weighed when it left the body. It's like, is there a micro something? That's something that's been tried. They didn't come to any conclusions on that. Which, if the soul is immaterial, it doesn't have any weight. So there's that. But now there's speculation that the soul resides in the cellular level. Because you all have cells, you're made up of cells, and there's a whole bunch of little bacteria that live inside of your cells that gives you energy. They're called mitochondria. So now they're saying, well, maybe the soul resides in each little cell, and the cells put together all then equal you and your soul. And really, we just don't know. We don't know. And I don't know if we ever will, because we're talking about some immaterial things. So when it comes to death, it's like this thing, like, when does it happen? How does it happen? It's almost like you know it when you see it. You know it when you experience it. And there's lots of different ways to experience a death. If you haven't experienced the death of somebody close to you that you love, you've certainly experienced the death of a part of your life that you enjoyed. Maybe you've experienced the death of health. And you used to be able to do certain things, and now you can't do them anymore. And there's a grieving process that needs to happen for that. Maybe you've experienced the death of a dream, the way that you thought your life was going to, play out. It didn't play out that way, and now you're kind of like, well, then where am I supposed to go, and how am I supposed to think about my life and where it goes? Or maybe you've had the death of a job, and you lost a job that you really loved, was important to you, and that really defined that moment in your life, and now you've moved on, and you're like, I got to reinvent myself. You ever had to reinvent yourself after you've gone through something that was kind of tragic? Those are small deaths. Death is not always just when a soul leaves a body, but death happens more often than we know. Because when we expect life to go a certain way, we expect the person to be in our life forever and always. When we expect things to turn out a specific way and it doesn't, there is an adjustment that happens. Death is to endure a loss that disrupts our way of being. And yes, that can be a loved one's death, passing and leaving your life. But there's little ones too along the way. Death happens all the time around us, and we have to figure out, how am I going to figure out life now that this big change has happened? Now, those of you who have been coming to this church for years and years will know this name I'm about to speak. And those of you who are new, let me introduce you to my friend Jim Putnam. He said, death is easy, it's dying, it's the hard part. He chuckled. That's the last words he ever spoke to me. Jim Putnam was a dear friend of mine. His wife, Joyce, watches online. Hi, Joyce. She's probably watching now. And Jim Putnam was here for the first year of my being a pastor, and I kind of took him and Joyce on as being a mentor in the community and in this church, and they're very wise people. And Jim had this condition. It was a blood condition that he knew he had an expiration date. I don't know. That seems weird to me, to know your expiration date is approaching. He outlived his expiration date by quite a bit, but I got to know him for the last year of his life through my first year of being a pastor here. And I took him to some of his doctor appointments and things like that. And towards the end, it got a little bit painful, as it tends to do. And I visited him the night before he passed, and he was very medicated up, lying on his hospital bed. And just kind of being there. There's not a whole lot left to do except be there. Wasn't expecting anything, and then all of a sudden he sat straight up and looked me in the eyes. It was not what I was expecting. And he said those words. And then he laid back down. And then I got a call later on that said he passed that night. And these words have really rocked my world. Death is easy, it's dying that's the hard part. And if you think about it, like is there any kind of work that goes into the death process? It just, boom, soul leaves, then you're done. Right? That was pretty easy. It happens to you, right? It's like, it just kind of happens. But there is a process when you know the loss is coming, or a process of adjusting to the loss that just happened that you didn't see, that is almost like a dying process, where you're going to have to get used to a new way of being. Death is when you endure a loss that disrupts your way of being. And that can be many different losses. As we talked about them, the loss of the death of an expectation, the death of a dream, the death of a job, the death of your health, the death of anything that comes in and disrupts your entire way of being is a death that needs to be grieved, and then you have to reinvent yourself on the other side, because you're still here. You have to figure out life on the other side of this death process and say, okay, this happened. There's no way I can deny it. No way I can get around it. I have to figure out how life is going to be on the other side. And if you want to have any kind of life after you've experienced a death or a loss, then you have to learn how to reinvent yourself on the other side without that, whatever it was that you lost, be it a loved one or something very physical like a job. You have to figure out how to reinvent yourself. And the Bible actually talks about this in the story of Christ over and over again. And it's the death and resurrection process. Have you ever noticed the death and resurrection process that we go through when we go through Advent all the way to Easter? And Easter is usually a big celebratory day, right? It's like the biggest high day on the church calendar. And it's probably that and Christmas Eve. Those are the two big days of the church calendar. But Easter is actually an 8-week season. It's not a one-day event. Easter is 8 weeks. What I think that we've done is that we've taken Easter, the big 8 weeks, and the actual narrative of what happened when Jesus resurrects from the dead, and we've narrowed it down to one day of making everything a big, victorious, yay Jesus, yay us, things are going to get better one day kind of a thing, which is yes, and it's important that we do celebrate the resurrection. But if we only make the Easter the one big day of celebration and we take it out of the narrative context, have you ever noticed how the disciples interacted with the resurrected Jesus? It's a little bit weird if you actually read the stories. You know, Jesus resurrects, and then we all say, yay, this is a great event, let's celebrate and have a party, and we do, and it's great. But the disciples have a different process. They're like, wait a second, who is this guy? We don't know this person. We didn't expect how this to be this way. What's going on? And they had no idea what to do with the resurrection. And I think there's a truth there that we can't let escape us in our celebrations and victories. We have to have the celebrations and victories because they are important and they keep life meaningful and moving and joyous. But there's also this piece of confusion about the resurrection. Have you ever had like a new life starts and you're just not sure what to do with it yet? You get a new job or you move to a new place or a big change happens and you're like, there's something new happening and I have no idea how I'm going to handle this. I have no idea where this is going. You've experienced resurrection. Resurrection is not just at the end when our loved ones are reunited with us and we go before it, where our bodies are brought back. That whole process, yes, it happens. It's the final one, but there's practicing resurrection in the midst because we have to practice the death process when we go through the big disruptions and changes of our life. That's practicing surrender. Because things happen to you. I don't know if you've noticed this yet before about your life, but things tend to happen to you that you didn't plan for and that you don't like and you don't enjoy, right? They happen. Things that are not fun, things that are not enjoyable, they happen to you. You didn't welcome them into your life. You didn't want them into your life, but here they are. And you have to figure out, how am I going to deal with this thing? Whether it is the big loss of a loved one, or your own health, or a job, or a dream, or something. And the death and resurrection process, you have to learn how to live in a surrendered spirit to God, saying, I know that God didn't give me this thing that is bad, but I know that if I live surrendered over to the faithfulness of God, He will walk me through this thing. You don't have to attribute evil to God and say, well, God gave me this thing and He won't give me more than I can handle, so I guess it must be okay. That's a way of just kind of bypassing around the actual tragedy of the event that you are enduring. You don't have to do that with God. You can actually just say, God did not give this to me, but God is with me in the midst of it and will walk me through. And that surrendered part is not a passive thing where you just sit back and say, well, God's going to do what God's going to do, so I guess I'll just kind of float along with life. Surrenderedness is an actual attentiveness to what God is asking of you in the very moment. In this very moment right now, being attentive to whatever action you might be called to do is to be surrendered to God. Not to be a passive, let life happen to me kind of a thing and pretend that that's faith in God. Sometimes it does require a little bit of passivity, but most of the time it is an attentiveness to your life, looking for God's action and direction and movement in it. And it's probably not going to be that dramatic like you think it's going to be. It's probably just the little things that you have to do. Like the next thing I got to do today is the dishes, and God's going to be with me here. I will do the dishes today. Sometimes it's not that dramatic. But there are big shifts and changes, and you have to learn how to be in that surrendered posture of attentiveness to how God is acting and moving in your current life right now as it presents itself to you, and not say, when everything fixes itself, then I'll see God, then I'll experience God, and then I'll say, oh, that's where it was. That's how God was with me. Sometimes you just have to do the dang dishes, which I have some dishes in the kitchen that I'll be doing a little bit later from my lunch last week. So sometimes that is faithfulness. Sometimes that is surrenderedness and attentiveness to the moment and saying, what's the next thing I have to do? The next thing you have to do might be something very boring. Cleaning the garage. That's on my list also. So this whole death and surrender, death is a practice of surrender, because when we get to the end of our days, it's a big surrender. We have to surrender ourselves over to the mystery of what happens after you close your eyes and your soul departs. And we have no idea what that looks like, what that entails, what kind of encounters, nothing. We have no clues at all. What is the great mystery beyond death? We have faith that God is there welcoming us, but we don't know what it looks like. We don't know how it's going to be and how it's going to play out. Nothing like that at all. And so death is a great surrender at the end. And so life, all the little deaths and changes and shifts and things that happen to you and around you, and you learning how to live in that moment, attentive to what God might be asking you and inviting you into, is to live in that practice of surrender and surrender and surrender. And love is practicing surrender, if you don't know that. Because love says someone else's reality is just important to them as mine is to me, and I have to now adjust myself for that. That's surrender. Practicing love and vulnerability is surrender. And all of life is this practice of surrender over to God. Very attentive, very active, very paying attention to the non-dramatic details of life and being faithful on the next thing kind of surrender. But then resurrection also, we get to practice that. Because sometimes new things come into your life, a new job, a new vision, a new something. And we can get really excited about those new things, a new relationship, a new community, a new town, a new job, a new diet you're going to try out, and a new health fad thing. We get very excited about those things, but we have no idea where it's going. And it can be very confusing to step into the new life where things have changed and shifted, and you've gone through loss and tragedy or whatever, and now you're here, and you get to start something new. Life on the other side of losing that loved one, sometimes that's not exciting. Sometimes it's a very grief process where you're like, I don't want to start a new thing. I don't want to try and do more different and new things. And you don't have to for a long time. Because you can sit in that period in between called Holy Saturday. You know that between the crucifixion and the resurrection, there is an entire day where the disciples have absolutely no hope that Jesus is going to resurrect and come out of the grave. It's an entire day. It's called Holy Saturday. And it's a day where you sit and do nothing. Where you just like, we're done. Let's go home. Let's go fishing. Let's whatever. We got to figure out how to put our life back together because what we thought was going to happen didn't. And now I don't know what to do with myself. There's an entire liturgical day called Holy Saturday where the disciples are confused and they're angry and they're sitting in the mess of this life that exploded on them, and they have no idea. You don't got to skip right over to resurrection. You can sit in the Holy Saturday moment for as long as it takes. Years sometimes, until you experience that invitation from God into the next thing. So that death and Holy Saturday and resurrection moment happens, but resurrection is not the big victory that you think it is. Because if you look at all that Jesus walked around for 40 days after he resurrected, according to the biblical stories. And everyone's like, we don't even know who this guy is. We don't recognize him. We don't know what he's asking of us. The disciples are absolutely confused. And so Easter resurrection can be a big celebration. And it ought to be, and I love that we do it. But then we got 7 weeks of like, okay, now what do we do with this resurrection thing that we don't understand? I don't know where this new life thing is going. I don't know how this is all going to play out. And then comes the time where you have these dreams and visions and you're like, okay, I think I have a direction set for this new thing, this new life, whatever it is that God's inviting me into. And then we have another moment on the church calendar called Ascension. Remember when Jesus ascends back up to the Father? Like, he just like, all right, see ya. I guess we're done. I don't know what's going on. The disciples are just kind of looking confused at the sky, like, okay, now what? And there's 2 angels have to appear and be like, hey, by the way, he will come back, but first you're going to experience the Holy Spirit come, and then, some things will happen. So even that moment, it's like, we don't know how to do this. But sometimes, and Jesus told Mary Magdalene, like, don't hang on to me, don't touch me, don't cling to me, because this isn't the thing. This whole vision you have in your head of the next thing and the new life and whatever it is and the new diet and the new job and the new relationship and the new town, like, that's great. Use the excitement there, but it's not the thing. It's not the thing. It's good. Let it be. Like, figure out what the next thing is in the next thing. It's always the next step. Number 1's always the first number. So you got to figure out what's the next thing. But then there's a moment where you're just being like, I don't understand this, but I'm going to give it back to God. And that's what the ascension moment means for us. We give that back to God, saying, I don't understand what you want me to do with this new life. I don't know where it's supposed to go. And then there's a period where you're like, okay, just wait. And then one day, like, life will just flood you again. And you'll be like, I think I have an idea of what I'm supposed to do now. And that's the moment of Pentecost, when the Spirit comes and fills the believers. And even then, it's not the arrival moment. Because if you've read the book of Acts, it's just an entire evolution of how they're getting it wrong constantly and then figuring it out on the fly. They're like, oh, I guess the Samaritans can have the Spirit now, I guess. I thought it was just a Jewish thing. Oh, I guess now the Gentiles can. Wow, look at that. Right? Like, it's a whole evolution of people are constantly confused. Don't think that the Bible is all these smart people that got it all figured out. The stories of the Bible are a bunch of people who are absolutely confused, have no idea what's happening, and they're just figuring it out on the fly, just like you and me. They're just figuring it out on the fly. So this is a little bit of a thing. Life is practice of this. That's all life is. It's practice of surrender and resurrection and entrusting that new thing to God and then receiving life to do that thing. Energy, vitality, whatever it is. You never arrive. If you're waiting for the next thing to happen, you're like, okay, the next thing, that's when happiness arrives, is when the next thing happens. You're never going to experience it. Because when it arrives, it doesn't bring happiness. Because happiness isn't found in the next thing. Happiness is found in the very present moment that you're in. And sometimes it's really hard to find it, I'll be honest. But it's here, and if you can't find it here, you're not going to find it there. So this whole death and resurrection thing is not like, now I have life figured out and we're good to go. Praise God and praise Jesus. And no, it's always confusion. It's always figuring it on the fly. It's never having it all figured out. But trusting in the character and nature that God is love and God walks with you through everything. And doesn't leave you and doesn't forsake you and doesn't abandon you. And this passage today, the disciples are that way. Like, how come you couldn't, you do all these miracles? Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you step in? Why didn't you save us? Why didn't you do? And Christ is like, doesn't answer it. It's this big mysterious thing. It doesn't answer it. Life is this practice of surrendering, experiencing new life, preparing us for that great surrender in the great unknown, whatever that is. And I'm hoping that I have the courage for my last words to say, I've been practicing for this moment my whole life. When I finally take my last breath, I hope those words, I'm courageous enough to say them and mean them. I'm going to try and live that way so that it's a practice for that moment. But that's what I'm aiming for. And our benediction is not a poem from Malcolm Guite today, which some of you might breathe a sigh of relief. It's actually a passage from the Wisdom of Solomon, from the Apocrypha, that I thought was really profound. So I want to read it to you. The souls of the righteous are in the hand of God, and no torment will ever touch them. In the eyes of the foolish, they seem to have died, and their departure was thought to be an affliction, and their going from us to be their destruction. But they are at peace. For though in the sight of men they were punished, their hope is full of immortality. Having been disciplined a little, they will receive a great good, because God tested them and found them worthy of himself. Like gold in the furnace, he tried them. And like a sacrificial burnt offering, he accepted them. In the time of their visitation, they will shine forth and will run like sparks through the stubble. They will govern nations and rule over peoples, and the Lord will reign over them forever. Those who trust in him will understand truth, and the faithful will abide in him in love, because grace and mercy are upon his elect, and he watches over his holy ones. Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 3, verses 1 through 9.